Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Christian. I'm the CEO of Artorias.
And today we're going to analyze the recent elections that happened in the United States, the off-year election, and see how it might impact foreign policy within the second Trump administration. Clearly, yesterday, on Tuesday, November 4th, the Democratic Party basically had the best case scenario in terms of election results. This has been a terrible result for a lot of the Republican Party, both in New Jersey and Virginia. The Democratic candidates won. In New Jersey, the governorship went to the Democrats, the Virginia governorship, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and a significant amount of the House of Delegates switched over to the Democratic Party. The Democrats won, at least as last we checked for this recording, over 13 seats, increasing their majority from 51 to close to 64 seats. We've also seen Democratic candidates win in Georgia for the first time in the state level in over 25 years. Two commissioners won in that election, and even in Mississippi, some special elections happened. And obviously, the big one also being in New York City, Zohar Mamdani is now the mayor-elect for New York City. And so the question that we wanted to pose for this episode is how this might impact, in a foreign policy perspective, the Trump administration, or if there's no impact whatsoever. I think one of the key aspects that we have seen is President Trump and his administration really take a lot of focus on foreign policy, probably much more so than people might have anticipated when analyzing kind of the 2024 election and this American first policy. There was a lot of conversations if we're going to turn into isolationists, reduce military presence overseas. And although there has been some alterations and obviously increased focus, let's say in the Western Hemisphere, foreign policy has been a predominant role in the first still year of the Trump administration. And, exemplified by the Trump strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, his involvement in Russia, Ukraine, the back and forth, and now really fully committed to Ukraine, tariff, initial hardline stance against China. Maybe now we're in a state of detente. So the question is this election going to change what we're seeing foreign policy-wise, or are we going to see a continuation of the Trump's kind of main focus, which I think right now, the main area that a lot of people are paying attention to is Venezuela. But having said that, Christian, I'll push this question to you. I guess the main question is this a situation where we might see a change? Are we going to see the Trump administration maybe take lessons learned from this election where affordability was one of the main key issues that clearly shown that Democrats really gained a lot in this election and see them focusing a lot more on domestic politics? Or is foreign policy still going to be a major issue for this administration? And maybe Venezuela, a strike inside of Venezuela against Maduro, might be coming sooner rather than later.
Ooh, this is a great topic because I get to analyze U.S. internal policy, which is always a fun one for me because people have a very a distaste a lot for my opinions for both sides of the aisle because I am so bipartisan with how I view things. But from a foreign policy perspective, I mean, Trump was elected one day ago last year. And in that time, we've seen U.S. foreign policy go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. His entire reason for winning in a lot of ways was due to the fact of like more of the isolationist movement that he was pushing during the election, which he has completely 180'd on. He has actually been more involved foreign policy wise than, and correct me if I'm wrong, his first administration or even the Biden administration in a lot of ways. He's meddling in pretty much every continent at this point and meddling in pretty much every conflict as well. So I don't think that's going to slow down. I think that especially with the Venezuela thing, it's such a gambit for him at this point. It has so much attention on it through press, through individuals, etc., that I think he'd be very lost if he dropped that and decided to pull out, for example, out of Southcom. If he stopped trying to be the quote unquote negotiator of world peace. I feel like if he was to step away from those roles, people would start looking more inward. And the US economy in its current state is a house of cards, as everybody knows. I mean, the AI bubble is hard to run from. Um, the S&P 500 is, yeah, it has great growth, but that growth is only being brought up by five companies, of the 500, and the rest of the economy is really hurting. Jobs reports are coming in, they're not where they expected. Um, there's layoffs left, right, and center for pretty much every sector at this point. The economy is facing stagflation, and we're seeing a lot of kind of repeat of what we saw in the Bush administration during the lead up to the economic crisis in 2008. And it's kind of a playbook. And seeing the Republicans do it again is kind of wild, in my opinion. But, if it worked the first time, I guess I let it ride the second time of kind of just like ignoring all of the economic problems and indicators and kind of just riding it out. And to my opinion, and that's why I believe the foreign policy stuff will continue, if not get more extreme, is just due to the fact that it moves people's eyes away from the major problems. And as we sit currently, Trump has a worse approval rating as of today than he has had in any of his terms or prior to him ever being the 45th or 47th president. So across the board, whether you're left, right, center, there is a lot of disapproval on a lot of the things that Trump is doing from an internal US policy perspective. At least he has some support from both sides on the geopolitical perspective. I think everybody can champion behind his peace deals and all of that. And though I am not a Trump supporter myself, as I'm saying this, I can admit that he has done a lot in terms of some geopolitical issues, especially in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, etc. He's definitely pushed the needle in a lot of those where there needed to be a leader to push those needles. He's done a great job with that. The stuff with Russia and Ukraine, I still think that his effectively schizophrenic policies in regards to that conflict is kind of all over the place and not doing anybody justice and not assisting either side in very much any way. And again, I think you and I, Stefano, will agree on this. Hopefully we don't, because there's no moderator like Matt usually is. But in terms of like South America, I think both of us can admit that the issues in South America are at a point where there does need to be involvement of a world leader such as the United States. Somebody needs to get involved. Um, we can we can argue on how he's doing that. I don't agree with the striking boats with Hellfire missiles or AC-130 gunships. I think you should definitely seize those vessels and arrest the people involved and try to get further intelligence on those rings that they're working for. That's just a personal opinion of mine. Yeah, I'd love to pass it back off to you and hear what your thoughts are on that as well.
Yeah, no, and I do think that we talked about South America, but another one that actually started to pick up is Trump's statements on his Truth Social um, related to Nigeria, right, and kind of the significant, ethnic violence against Christians in Nigeria. We've seen President Trump in his Truth Social highlight that if Nigeria doesn't clamp down on that, alluding to kind of ISIS West Africa, Boko Haram, and other ethnic tensions that goes on in Nigeria targeting Christians, that the U.S. military will respond directly to this. We've seen the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, kind of reinforce that, in addition to kind of what we're seeing in Venezuela, where I believe 2 days ago, the carrier strike group just crossed over from the Straits of Gibraltar, heading straight over to the Caribbean, which should arrive within this week. And that's kind of a significant strike package that will be enabled for them to obviously do operations in Venezuela. So, we are seeing where, let's say, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia kind of finishes, the focus goes to somewhere else, Venezuela, and now Nigeria. And just for our listeners, next week's episode, we're actually going to do Africa. We're going to cover the Sahel. We're going to cover Nigeria. We're going to cover the ethnic cleansings that we covered last week in Sudan and Darfur, specifically with the rapid support forces. We're also going to talk about Mali specifically in the Sahel in general, because ISIS in Greater Sahara and JNM, well, specifically JNM, they're right outside of the capital of Mali, Bamako. So that is definitely a very worrying development, where we might run into a situation where an Islamic State or an Islamic terrorist organization it owns a foreign capital. And so next week we'll definitely cover that, and I think that's going to have a lot of major implications for the Trump administration as well if it happens. But going to your point, I think one of the interesting aspects where I think the Trump administration has done something very differently than we've historically seen other administrations done, and this is kind of a novel approach. And it's really tying in American economic policy and, more importantly, in American economic power in relations to their negotiations with other countries and really intertwining it with foreign policy, right? Because generally, when we're talking about how we've seen other administrations act with economic tools, is basically sanctions, right? And a lot of times they're targeted sanctions against key individuals, and they might slowly increase and broad increase and be much more severe, but within the constructs of sanctions because of a specific, let's say, human rights violations or violating U.S. national security or national interest. Where I think the Trump administration has done is they managed to bend both together, and specifically related to the tariffs, where in many aspects, one of the tools, I mean, if you look at Thailand and Cambodia, I mean, there was intense negotiations that was happening, and it was really I think the major threat of significant tariffs on both in Thailand and Cambodia that basically got both sides to agree to a ceasefire, connecting that aspect, right? And we've always known that the Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, is part of the National Security Council, but in all honesty, in many aspects, when you're talking about foreign policy, you wouldn't necessarily view the Treasury Secretary as a main figure, right? That's generally a different aspect within American foreign policy. It's almost like, there's overlap, but it's two bubbles with small overlap. And I think what we're seeing the Trump administration really doing is really connecting both, right? Where the current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, I think has a lot more influence in foreign policy because of the tariffs. And that gives them a lot of leverage. I think in their opinion, gives them leverage to kind of push through either American interest or foreign policy objectives, specifically related to kind of these ceasefire negotiations. And I think, though, that's kind of the interesting aspect now when we're analyzing other areas, for example, well, we mentioned Nigeria, but specifically Venezuela. One of the interesting aspects also in Venezuela is like, really a lot of the forcefulness that we really saw in Venezuela was from the Attorney General Pam Bondi when she released the video statement, and specifically calling out Maduro as the leader of Cartel de los Soles or the Sun Cartel, and putting a $50 million bounty on his head, which is double what Bin Laden had prior to his death in 2011 in the Obama administration. And I think that's kind of an interesting aspect, right? And then I guess the question that we have to analyze is this kind of the continuation of what we might see in a future administration, right? Do we see that mixing? And, with the specific election that we're seeing in the United States yesterday, that again, for our listeners who might not be very well known in American domestic politics, it's important to note that generally the major elections happen twice a year. The next major one is next year, 2026, which is kind of the midterm elections. That's where the entirety of the U.S. House is up for vote and a third of the Senate. And then you have other major gubernatorial races and state races as well. But that's the big one. 2028 is the presidential election. But in those off years, as this one, 2025 or 2020, the next one, obviously, the big one would be in 2029. There's two key races. It's generally the year when the new administration comes in, and that's the elections, the governor's election in New Jersey and Virginia. That kind of gives an idea of where the country's heading. In 2021, shortly after Biden was elected, that's when we did see kind of in Virginia, at least, not in New Jersey, but in Virginia, Governor Youngkin, he won the election. That was kind of the first indication that we got that, okay, maybe there's issues within the Biden administration in the economy or in domestic politics, and the Republicans might find a way to kind of work their way in and back into power that obviously we saw in 2024. So then going back to it, this meshing of economic policy and foreign policy, it's an interesting dynamic that I do believe gives a lot of leverage. And the question is open, does that continue or do we see that split as we've seen in previous administrations? But this election then brings back the conversation of how does this election change that? And there's now much more inward focus? We saw a report today from Politico that, one advisor to Trump and kind of related to the campaign, he actually specifically singled out in the Trump administration saying, look, the no new wars or the peace president and our foreign involvement or the bombing of Iran, we try to push this messaging of strength and diplomacy and wins and foreign policy wins, and it just didn't resonate with the American people, at least specifically New Jersey and Virginia. And so the question is like, okay, do we have to go back to this issue of affordability? And it's interesting because you look at China and kind of this detente that we've seen in the G2 summit between President Xi and President Trump, where kind of there's an agreement to lower tariffs, not completely remove it, and then China agreeing to buy American soybeans again. You're seeing that maybe that was kind of a concern, and so was the tariff threat, hurting the U.S. economically, hurting, you know, Republicans in the ballot, which then might remove that leverage as we've seen being used, specifically threats of tariffs for foreign policy objectives. It's really out there. We really don't know. Another important note, Christian, to highlight is today the Supreme Court did hear arguments about the legality and the constitutionality of Trump's broad tariffs. And it's important to note that the Supreme Court justices did sound skeptical in the sense that they view tariffs as something that, is, for a very brief summary, basically viewed it as a tax that should fall within the powers of Congress as the U.S. Constitution articulates, not necessarily just a unilateral power for the president to use broadly. And so I think that's kind of the thing that, that's where I'm wondering if this election might reduce the aspect of tariffs as a tool for foreign policy, which we have seen achieve results. But to answer your question before I push it on to you, from the Venezuela piece, right, and the strikes, it's really hard to really necessarily say one way or another. I mean, I would agree with you. Generally, we've seen this being more law enforcement. It's important to note that Coast Guard has been also very involved. I think we're talking about the military. The Coast Guard clearly is having a lot of success, specifically in the Pacific Coast with the Ecuadorian Navy. They've seen significant amount of cocaine just recently off the coast of the Pacific. Just last week, another vessel was seized with over a ton of cocaine. And we're still seeing that law enforcement component. But I think what the Trump administration is basically following a mold is something that we've seen across the Western Hemisphere, specifically in South and Central American countries and countries in the Caribbean, which is a militarization already of the drug war, because basically they either have no other tools or because the groups they're fighting and the gangs and the cartels that they're fighting have militarized themselves. And so, we'll see. I think Marco Rubio is going to brief the Gang of Eight. Obviously, there's a lot of concern within Congress, bipartisan within Congress, about the legality of these strikes, the broad breadth of these strikes. The Trump administration is taking, is not really necessarily considering this part of the War Powers Act, and they're giving this broad authority for the Trump administration to continue. And I think if we see strikes against Maduro, they're going to use the same legal argument that necessarily the U.S. is not in active hostilities. This is more fighting, organized crime. And more importantly, that's how they're going to identify Maduro, which they've already publicly claimed that he's not a legitimate leader, but the leader of a cartel. But Christian, I'll push it back to you.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you because I know you're more privy to the Supreme Court rulings that are, as you say, going on. The hearings are active on the tariff situation. Because and maybe this is like a good place for me to like pass it back to you. Do you believe that Trump is kind of pulling a Bush in a lot of the ways with the current economic policy within the U.S. of just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what works? Or do you think that there is truly kind of an end game that he has with these tariffs and other policies that he has, that he actually legitimately thinks that this will work out in the favor of his party and his administration's goals?
What's interesting, and I find that a fascinating question. I think one thing is what Trump thinks, and the other thing is what kind of the base thinks, right? Because you've heard both arguments, right, of tariffs. One of the arguments is this is a way for reindustrialization of America. Tariffs should stay in place. I've even heard arguments saying that tariffs should replace the income tax, and then it's an opportunity to America, I guess, quote unquote, reindustrialize, something kind of like moving away from a consumer-based economy, which has worked for the American economy overall. And then the other side is it's a way for the Americans to kind of leverage tariffs to say, okay, no, we need access to foreign markets. It's almost like, this kind of this free trade argument, right? It's the stick to get the carrot, and the carrot is kind of, broad-based access to foreign markets, and we still have tariffs. And it's important to note that a lot of the deals that the Trump administration announced, I think it's important to note they haven't been ratified by Congress, right? These are frameworks. These aren't actual trade deals as we know what trade deals mean, because trade deals require negotiations from the executive and then passage through Congress for them to be established within the law, right? That's what we saw in the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, right? The very famous Trans-Pacific Partnership during the Obama administration that did not make it did not get passed by Congress, and they kind of did it without the United States. An idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to solidify an economic trade agreement in the Pacific, excluding China, and we didn't, necessarily jump into that. But that's kind of the argument. So these are just frameworks where, and I think this is kind of tied into the Supreme Court case, because the Trump administration and the perfect example is with China. They quickly raised tariffs. They announced significant increases in tariffs by a due date, leverage that for negotiations, and then maybe those get reduced. And I think that's where the Supreme Court is a little bit concerned. If you kind of hear the broad sense of the arguments, that they feel like, hey, this should fall within the powers of Congress, specifically how broad the Trump administration has done it. But again, it goes back to where I think the Trump administration, in a way, is viewing this is because it's a foreign policy tool, right? I don't necessarily think per se that the idea of tariffs, when we're seeing the Trump administration leverage it not only domestically but foreignly, yes, there's some ways to try to encourage reinvestment in America, but the biggest success where I think tariffs has played a role within the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, is in foreign policy, which again, it kind of goes away from the historical norms of the United States, because again, most administrations had viewed tariffs as a specific weapon related to economic policy, specifically, let's say, trade imbalances or imperfect economic practices, specifically related to China, and they're very much targeted. And then they leverage that targeted tariff to then have negotiations to see, okay, can we get something, an agreement, or maybe the WTO reaches, mediates, et cetera, by national negotiations or regional negotiations to try to solve it. But it's been always very targeted, similar to sanctions, but sanctions has always followed more on the foreign policy perspective, right? Like if you were to go, let's analyze the Biden administration, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Reagan administration, even though Reagan was not a huge fan of tariffs. But generally, if you would see the applications of tariffs, even to our allies, let's say France or Germany or Japan, it was specifically in very limited sectors because of concerns of very specific U.S. manufacturing base, right? But that, even within the construct of bilateral negotiations, or bilateral relations, I should say, it didn't really impact the broader scheme of the geopolitical arena, right? So if the United States announced tariffs against Japan on a specific car sector, right, under, let's say, the Obama administration, the construct of the U.S.-Japanese relations, it didn't really broadly impact that. We've seen that switch with the Trump administration because of how broad they have been used, how expansive they have been used, and such a wide net that inherently would impact bilateral relations. Where I think the Trump administration, again, has had the most amount of success in this is in Thailand, Cambodia is a perfect example, right? And this idea that where the Trump administration also goes back to is with, let's say, Armenia and Azerbaijan and the agreement that they reached. The Trump administration really leveraged this idea of trade negotiations and trade access and access to U.S. markets and access to U.S. goods to really expand those countries' economies. When in the past, where that generally has fallen, that generally hasn't been necessarily the norm when the United States played a mediating role. Right? Generally, the United States would try to play a mediating role, not necessarily involve U.S. economic interests. Generally. I mean, there's exceptions, obviously, but the grand scheme of things, that's generally what we've seen. And then generally, when there's agreements or there's an interest in expanding U.S. soft power from an economic lens, it generally fell more within the line of the State Department and USAID. That has changed with the Trump administration, specifically how we've seen the State Department really been gutted and the USAID completely, for all intents and purposes, defunct at this point. They have switched that into incorporating the Treasury Department as part of the foreign policy and national security arm of the United States, when there was that small barrier between two. And again, the problem, though, goes, if you're leveraging tariffs for negotiations specifically in China, and there's an economic harm to American citizens who then vote, is that something that then might send a message to the Trump administration saying we might not want to take this approach so significantly? I don't think we're there yet. Obviously, the Supreme Court ruling, which, again, it was just a hearing, we haven't had a ruling on this case, will be very significant, because if we have a decision from the Supreme Court, and as they were laying out the questions, it did seem that the Supreme Court was very skeptical and they were going to rule against the Trump administration. If we see a ruling against tariffs, I think that's going to be a much more significant change in how the Trump administration applies foreign policy, because the main tool that they've had has basically disappeared, right? And I think the question that we have to ask, though, going back to kind of the policies that the Trump administration, the foreign policy, is in 2025, we have seen an increase of intrastate conflict, right? I mean, between and interstate conflicts, specifically the interstate conflicts with one nation and another fighting each other, right? And when we look at the Biden administration, obviously Israel, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine were the big ones. But even during the first 11 months of the Trump administration, we've seen significant conflict spread out around the world, starting with the Democratic Republic of Congo. We saw it with Thailand, Cambodia, Israel, Iran, right? We've seen that. And I guess the question that many have to ask is this kind of because, let's say, the State Department and the National Security Council have been gutted so significantly that we didn't have kind of these foreign policy and diplomats in the United States capable of managing this conflict before it reaches to the president. And that by the time the president got involved, it's because really it was very, very dangerous. And I think India and Pakistan is a key example of that. Where in the beginning, when we were doing our spaces when India Pakistan started, we started to highlight how the US had no involvement. And then as the war progressed, it became from no involvement to very significant involvement. And there's been reporting to indicate is there was a concern because of the nuclear weapons that both countries have. Right. And I think that's not the ideal scenario. You try to measure success in foreign policy by the wars that are not going on. And I think by gutting the State Department and the USAID, although now we've seen a lot of ceasefires, et cetera, kind of push through, I think that is the question. It doesn't necessarily prevent. We don't have the tools to prevent conflicts, and the Treasury Department and tariffs are not really there in place to prevent conflict. And generally, they're applied when conflict has already started. Now, it might be a good tool to end the wars and end the conflicts, but not necessarily to prevent it from starting at the beginning, which has generally been the role of the State Department and USAID. And now that's the thing. If the Supreme Court, or let's say because of U.S. domestic politics, the Trump administration is concerned about the cost of living and inflation, which clearly was a key, and affordability, which was a key domestic issue in this last election. If they start being cognizant and concerned about applying tariffs, I just don't see what other tools the US government really has right now under the Trump administration. Because again, it used to fall within the aid, the Congress would pass a bill, pass a budget within the State Department, USAID, or a grand scheme of term they would come up with, and would be injecting money into a specific region. We've seen the Bush administration do that a lot in Africa. We've seen that generally been the policy in place for Central and South America, which now is taking a much more militarized approach. That's generally how it is. Now it's tariffs, but you can't apply tariffs everywhere at all times. And so that's kind of the concern. And I just don't necessarily see it moving forward. And let's be honest, related to Russia-Ukraine, where the Trump administration with Russia tried to leverage trade access and economic access to the United States, the Russians just don't care. Vladimir Putin doesn't care. I think the Ukrainians did, but they're more interested about the money. And where Zelensky was very successful is tying aid to Ukraine, not from a national security perspective for the US, but from an economic interest for the US. That's where I think he was much more successful. And maybe that's what we're going to start seeing a lot of foreign leaders do. But it didn't work necessarily with Russia. And China's kind of up for debate how effective it was, because there was a quick detente. And we have seen some of the rare earth minerals that the Chinese kind of limited in exports, start to release again to foreign countries. So, it's a very long-winded answer, but I think it kind of fits within the frame of the Trump administration's foreign policy. And I think this is, if we're going to come up with a Trump doctrine, I don't necessarily think it's America first per se. I think the true Trump doctrine is the application of how economic policy, specifically trade and tariffs, played a central role in American foreign policy, which is something we haven't seen in the past.
I don't even know how to come back from that, honestly. That being said, I guess a good note to end on in regards to this is, do you think that this cycle, this November, what we just experienced, will be the playbook for the midterms coming up next year? Or is it too early to call? Or do you think, what are your opinions on it? Because for how I look at this individually is that the Democrats have obviously swept through one where they could win, and they're going to take that victory and know exactly what to do next time, is kind of how I'm looking at it. And with the approval ratings, as if everything stayed exactly the same, if the midterms were tomorrow, for example, I believe the Democrats would absolutely sweep through, just as they did yesterday. What's your analysis on that?
I think one of the interesting aspects, I think there is a new generation of Democratic leaders, and I wouldn't necessarily look at the governors. And I know a lot of people are looking at. I would look more at the mayors, and Mamdani is just one. There's a lot of Democratic mayors that have a lot of influence and power, and they have very successful messaging. One of the key ones I'm looking at is Michelle Wu from Boston, she ran unopposed in Boston for her reelection and won, obviously, right? And she has extreme approval rating in Boston. And that, those are the areas that I would be looking at. I think affordability, that's where the sex tax happened, was a lot of that in the affordability case. Maybe Virginia is a little bit different, where some of the government shutdown clearly had an impact in a lot of the areas there. And maybe there was some concerns about Trump's domestic policies. But I think affordability is going to be a key aspect in this, and where the Democrats are going to run forward. And then that, again, that has the question, though, then how does that kind of translate into the foreign policy realm with these new Democratic leaders? Because generally within these Democratic leaders that are coming up, they're much more in the sense of, I'm not going to say necessarily isolationist, but they're not the traditional, what we grew accustomed, well, bipartisanship. They're not the Joe Bidens when he was in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right? That's not how they've been identified. I think where the Democratic Party, at least in a foreign policy perspective, is they've identified NATO as a key cornerstone of American foreign interests. Obviously, they're much more hawkish, let's say, related to Israel after Israel and Gaza. So that's something obviously they could look at. But I do believe affordability is the next message that will persist through to 2026 and then even up to 2028. And that's going to be the major conversation that's going on. But the key question from foreign policy, as I said previously, and I'll end on this note, is this Trump doctrine. I think I don't think necessarily that analysis is being taken seriously. I think a lot of times when we're talking about Trump doctrine, people talk about isolationism, America first, but it doesn't necessarily really change much of how things were done necessarily. What really is the fundamental change is the economic policies and how it's being done. And I would be interested in seeing, what does a next Democrat or Republican president look like? What does the one in 2028 look like? And does the Treasury Secretary play such a key role? Because in the end of the day, Christian, I think that what's a very interesting aspect, historically, we would look at the Secretary of State's foreign travel as a key component of American foreign policy interests in Washington, D.C., right? In U.S. press. Where's the Secretary of State going? The Treasury Secretary, not so much. It historically wasn't. Now, though, it's fundamentally different. And I would make the argument to keep an eye on Scott Bessent wherever he goes, what he's talking about, not only for American domestic politics, but more importantly, or the economy, but more importantly, foreign policy. And I think he has gained significant amount of influence. And is that a temporary aspect of the Trump doctrine? Or is that going to be a permanent fixture of American foreign policy moving forward?
I'm not even going to answer that. I think your spiel will allow people to actually make their own conclusion. What I wanted to end on is kind of touching on the Mamdani, because I think that is the crucial election everybody was paying attention to last night, was the New York City election and how he absolutely swept through Cuomo. Obviously, the Republican candidate there had zero chance. It's New York City after all. But I want to highlight some of his policies, because they're the policies that Mayor Wu had in New York City during her first campaign that everybody said wouldn't work. They're too expensive. They're too socialist, blah, blah, blah. And that was coming from both parties, just as Mamdani's campaign has experienced that from both the Republicans as well as the Democrats. But Mayor Wu, and again, this is coming from somebody who lives in the Boston geographical area of the world. Like, that is my major metro area. That is where I go shopping. That's where I'm raising my child, et cetera, et cetera. I will be the first person to say that Boston is the cleanest city in the United States, bar none. It is the cleanest. It is the safest. The public transport is now becoming the best. As we see other cities, much to the same extent that New York City, for example, is starting to trail back when it's public services, whether that be the metro or the bus or the subway, etc. If you read Mayor Wu's, if you go to boston.gov, click over to the department's mayor's office, look at Michelle Wu's page, what she initially ran on was making housing more affordable for everybody else, which she managed to do. She has actually done that. Gun violence is the lowest level on record in the entire city since they started measuring it. She expanded the pre-K system for basically the entire city for all the residents there. She's made the city safer in regards to bike lanes, and it's the common joke here up in Boston area that there are too many fucking bike lanes, which I will be the first person to admit there are way too many fucking bike lanes. But it's one of the policies. Again, these are direct policies that Mamdani ran on and has won in New York City, which gives me hope. And to your point, it gives hope on other things. She also initiated a fare free Boston bus line service, which is something that everybody in New York City, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, looked at Mamdani's campaign and was like, that's kind of impossible. There's already discounted rates, but there's never like flat free rates like there is in Boston. If he's able and I'm assuming the between their campaigns and their managers, they're definitely in conversation. It's the new wave of the Democrats, if you will. Like I believe there is some sort of cabal there. They're discussing how they can work both for winning elections, but as well as actually implementing the plans. If he is as successful as Mayor Wu, that is two major cities in the United States, at least in the East Coast, two major metro areas within the United States where both of those policies show to work. And if that's the case, going into the 2028 elections, as you mentioned, Stefano, and alluded to, I see the Democrats absolutely walking away with a victory. So unless there is some counterweight to this that the Republicans can somehow buy into, I absolutely 150% say that the next Democratic leader of the United States in 2028 is running on all of those policies using the administrations that are currently in place. And at that point, I believe Wu will be old enough to run. And if she does run for president, I would vote for her. Just full disclosure, you'll know where I sit politically. But if you go and look at the polls and the numbers for Wu's campaign in Boston, she was untouchable. Everything that she implemented in her administration, everything she ran on in 2021 that she's put into place now has worked.
Well, I guess that's something to keep an eye on for 2028. I mean, no, it's funny. We did not coordinate this. That's why I had to highlight Michelle Wu because I think that's a key up and coming leader within the Democratic Party. And I guess for a lot of our listeners that are interested in foreign policy, there's been an interesting aspect of what her foreign policy positions are on a lot of these key issues, and that's something to keep an eye on. Again, to our listeners, we'll just remind you that next week we will be having an episode covering about key aspects in Africa, specifically Nigeria, Mali, Sudan, and the Greater Sahel region. There's a lot of conflicts, and I think specifically in Sudan, there's a genocide going on again in the Darfur region of horrific videos that is coming out of thousands of people that have been killed, if not tens of thousands of people. And I think that's a very important conversation. And obviously, the Trump administration has singled out Nigeria, and Trump today in a video statement has highlighted again the threat of using military force against Nigeria. So if you're a staffer sitting in AFRICOM and at the beginning of the administration you were concerned and there was reporting that they were going to get away from AFRICOM and put it under EUCOM, I think it's safe to say that your position is pretty secure. And it's also important to note that in the backdrop of all this, AFRICOM has continued to conduct strikes in Somalia, targeting ISIS Somalia and Al-Shabaab. And that's probably where we've seen the most amount of U.S. military kinetic activity is in Somalia, probably even greater than historically than what we've seen in the Caribbean right now, although that is picking pace. We're obviously going to continue to monitor the situation in Venezuela and the deployment of the carrier strike group. So make sure you stay tuned and monitor our pages for any latest news and developments there. But with that, this has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast, and we'll see you soon.